The sun had just started to rise, spreading soft orange light over the quiet neighborhood. Birds sang from the trees that lined the street, and a man stepped out of his small house holding a leash. A large black dog came out beside him, tail wagging, eyes bright. The man gave a gentle smile and patted the dog's head. "Morning, buddy," he said softly. The dog barked once, eager to start their usual morning walk. They walked together every single day, following the same route through the park and around the lake. People who lived nearby often saw them but knew little about the man. He was polite, calm, and always kept to himself. When someone greeted him, he returned the smile but rarely said more than a few words. Some neighbors thought he might be shy. Others simply believed he liked peace and quiet. What no one knew was that he had once been one of the most capable and fearless soldiers in the country. He had led men into missions so dangerous that few dared even speak of them, but he never told anyone about that part of his life. After leaving the military, he wanted nothing but silence and normal days. He wanted to forget the sound of gunfire and explosions and live a life where the loudest noise was his dog's bark. The dog was everything to him. He had found him years ago when he was still recovering from nightmares of the battlefield. The dog had been a rescue, thin and frightened, but loyal from the first moment. They healed each other in ways no one else could understand. The man had seen brave soldiers fall beside him, but the love of this animal had helped him find strength again. Every time he looked into those brown eyes, he saw trust, not fear. That simple bond kept him grounded. One morning after their run, they sat on the porch together. The man poured water into a bowl for the dog and took a deep breath, feeling the calm breeze. A small boy from next door waved to him. "Your dog's name is Shadow, right?" the boy asked shyly. The man nodded. "Yes, he likes to stay close." "That's how he got the name," the boy laughed. "He's really cool." The man smiled, and for a second a bit of warmth filled his face. Then he looked away, lost in thought. He often wondered if peace could last forever. In his life, peace had always been temporary. That evening, the air was slightly colder and clouds gathered above. The man took Shadow for a walk near a half-finished construction site. It wasn't far from home, and the area was usually quiet. Shadow sniffed around happily, exploring the grass near the fence. The man had his hands in his jacket pockets, thinking about how he might finally write a letter to one of his old military friends. Life had been good lately, and for the first time he thought he might be ready to reconnect. Far down the street, a group of workers noticed him walking near the site. They didn't recognize him and whispered among themselves. One of them pulled out a phone and made a quick call to report a suspicious man with a big black dog. It was an unnecessary call, but fear and assumptions often travel faster than truth. Minutes later, a police car slowly rolled into the street, lights flashing softly. The man looked up, surprised. Shadow stopped walking and stood beside him. Two officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts. "Sir, can we talk to you for a moment?" one of them said. The man nodded calmly, unsure what was going on. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The officer looked him up and down. "We got a report about someone walking around this site after hours." The man frowned lightly. "I live 2 blocks away. I walk my dog here every evening." Shadow sat down beside him, quiet and still. The dog's behavior showed no aggression, but one of the officers seemed uneasy. The man noticed it and spoke softly. "He's friendly." "Don't worry." The officer's hand tightened slightly on his holster. The conversation was simple at first. The man showed his ID and explained again that he lived nearby. The officers nodded, but the nervous one kept his eyes on Shadow. The dog wagged his tail once, maybe sensing the tension. Suddenly, a sound echoed from somewhere behind the construction site, perhaps a piece of metal falling. Shadow turned quickly toward the noise, his ears up. The movement startled the tense officer. In a flash of fear, the officer shouted, "Hey! Get that dog back!" Before the man could even react, a shot rang out. The silence that followed was the kind that no one forgets. The man froze. Shadow collapsed on the ground, letting out a small, confused whine. The man's knees gave way and he fell beside his dog, pressing a trembling hand against the wound. His mind refused to believe what had just happened. No, stay with me," he whispered. But the life was already slipping from Shadow's eyes. The officer's voice broke through the air, shaking. "He moved fast. I thought he was coming at me." The man didn't answer. He just held Shadow tighter, his face wet with tears he didn't even feel. Neighbors began coming out of their houses, drawn by the sound. Someone shouted for help. Another began recording on a phone. The other officer stood speechless, realizing the terrible mistake. The man looked up at them, eyes filled with something deeper than anger. It wasn't rage. It was the look of someone who had seen death too many times and couldn't believe he was seeing it again. Here in the life he had built to escape it. The officers tried to explain, but their words stumbled over each other. "Sir, please," he moved suddenly. "I had no choice." The man didn't speak. He just lifted his dog gently, carried him to the side of the road and sat there. The light rain began to fall, mixing with the blood on his hands. Every breath felt heavy. The faces around blurred into shapes. He could hear sirens approaching from a distance, but inside everything was quiet. When the backup officers arrived, they tried to calm the situation, but the damage was already done. The man stayed silent as they asked questions. His voice finally broke when one officer asked if there was anyone they could call for him. "No," he said softly. "There's no one left." His words made the younger officer lower his eyes in shame. Later, after the crowd had dispersed, the man returned home alone. The leash still hung around his wrist, empty. Inside his small living room, the house felt hollow. He placed the leash on the table and sat down, staring at the floor. The television was on, but he didn't notice what it showed. His mind kept replaying the same few seconds, the flash, the sound, the fall. For a soldier who had survived countless battles, this felt like the deepest wound of all. That night, sleep didn't come. He sat by the window watching rain slide down the glass. His thoughts wandered to the missions he had led years ago, the men he had lost, and how he had promised himself never to fight again. He had believed the world outside the war was safer, fairer, but now he wasn't sure. The people who were supposed to protect life had just taken the only one that truly mattered to him. In the morning, there was a knock at his door. A local woman from the neighborhood stood there holding a small basket of food. She looked worried. "We heard what happened," she said softly. "I'm so sorry." He thanked her politely but didn't invite her in. He didn't have the strength to speak about it. After she left, he walked out to the backyard where Shadow used to run. The grass was still damp from the rain. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space until his knees gave out and he sat on the ground, his head bowed. For a moment, he wished he could disappear too. As hours turned into days, the story began to spread. Someone had posted the video online. It showed the man holding his dying dog, calm and broken, while police tried to explain themselves. Comments flooded in from people around the country. Some were angry, others heartbroken. But most didn't know who the man really was. They saw him only as another victim of an unjust mistake. He didn't care about the attention. He avoided the news, ignored the phone calls, and didn't respond to messages from strangers offering help. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted silence. He buried Shadow in the field behind his house, marking the spot with a simple wooden cross. No crowd, no ceremony, just a quiet goodbye. As he stood there, wind moving gently through the trees, he whispered, "You were the best of us, my friend." For the first time in years, his voice cracked with emotion. But deep inside, something had begun to stir. The calm discipline that had carried him through war was returning. But this time it carried a different weight. He wasn't thinking of revenge, he was thinking of truth. He had spent his life protecting others, upholding a code of honor that demanded respect and responsibility. Seeing it broken in front of him reignited that sense of duty. He knew the world had to hear what really happened, not through anger but through honesty. That evening he opened an old wooden box that he hadn't touched in years. Inside were medals, photos, and folded letters from the past. He looked at each one quietly, remembering faces and voices long gone. Then he placed them back one by one except for a single medal, a small silver star that had once been pinned to his uniform after a mission that saved countless lives. He placed it on the table beside Shadow's leash and sat staring at both objects for a long time. One represented his service to the country, the other represented the peace he had tried to build afterward. Now both were tied together in pain. When night came, he stepped outside again. The neighborhood was quiet as usual. The streetlights cast soft circles of light on the wet pavement. He looked up at the sky, whispered a short prayer, and turned back inside. The world would see him as a man who had lost a dog, but soon they would learn who he really was. The man who had once led warriors through the most dangerous corners of the earth, and survived only to lose the one life that truly mattered. He sat down at his desk, opened his old notebook and began to write. Not as a soldier, but as a man searching for meaning. Every word was simple, raw, and true. He didn't write about anger or revenge. He wrote about love, loyalty, and the way people often forget that peace is as fragile as glass. By the time the night ended, his eyes were heavy. But for the first time since the shooting, his heart felt a small spark of direction. Outside, the wind carried the sound of leaves moving across the road. The same road he had walked with Shadow every morning. Somewhere inside him, he felt that his story with Shadow wasn't finished yet. Something told him that this loss would lead to something greater, something that would force the world to see him not as a victim, but as the man he truly was. And as he turned off the lamp, the darkness felt different, not empty, but waiting. The days after Shadow's death felt unreal. The man moved through his house like a ghost, doing everything in silence. He would boil water for coffee and forget to drink it. The leash still lay on the table beside the silver medal. Sometimes he stared at it for hours as if waiting for the door to open and for Shadow to come running again. The sound of barking from other houses cut through him like a knife. He missed the warmth that used to fill the space. At first, he didn't want to leave the house at all. People from the neighborhood came by offering condolences, food, or kind words, but he kept the visits short. They meant well, but nothing they said could reach him. The world outside his door had taken something sacred, and he didn't know how to face it. Every night he dreamed of Shadow running through the grass, turning back to look at him and then fading into the distance. He would wake up covered in sweat, the sound of the gunshot echoing in his head. But slowly, something began to shift. A local reporter left a note in his mailbox asking for an interview. The note was polite, but he ignored it. Then another came and another. Finally, one morning, as he sat on his porch staring at the empty leash, an older man from the neighborhood approached him carefully. "People are talking," the neighbor said softly. "They say the police haven't said much about what happened. Maybe you should tell your side of it." The man nodded but didn't respond. Still, the words lingered in his mind. Later that day, he turned on the television for the first time in a week. The local news station was running a short segment about the incident. They called it a tragic misunderstanding. The anchor read from a paper, saying the police department had launched an internal review. That was all. No apology, no acknowledgement of who Shadow had been or what that dog meant to him. The man turned off the TV and sat there, fists clenched. That night, he went to his small office room. It was filled with old papers and dusty boxes from his military days. He sat at the desk, opened the notebook where he had written a few days ago, and began writing again. This time, he didn't write about pain. He wrote about truth, what happened that night, how it felt, what it took from him. The words came easily. For the first time since the shooting, he felt a sense of control. He wasn't going to fight anyone. He was going to make sure the world knew the truth. The next morning, he called the reporter who had left the first note. They met at a small cafe downtown. The reporter was young but respectful, asking questions gently. The man spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He described the night of the shooting, the officers' reactions, and the silence that followed. When the reporter asked about his background, he hesitated for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I served in the Delta Force for 20 years. I've seen war, I've seen loss, but nothing prepared me for losing him like that." The reporter's eyes widened slightly. She had no idea. The story ran 2 days later. The headline read, "Local veteran mourns dog killed by police in mistaken incident." It didn't take long for the story to spread. People online began sharing it, outraged by the details. Thousands of comments appeared overnight, most of them supportive, many calling for justice. The man didn't read them all, but he felt the weight of people's empathy. For the first time, he wasn't alone in his grief. Soon after, a lawyer who specialized in civil rights reached out to him, offering to represent him free of charge. The man wasn't interested in lawsuits or money, but the lawyer convinced him that this wasn't only about Shadow. "If you don't speak up," the lawyer said, "they'll call it a mistake and move on. This could change things." After a long silence, the man agreed. The following weeks were filled with interviews and meetings. He found himself standing in front of microphones speaking to cameras. It was strange at first. He had spent years avoiding attention, but now his story was everywhere. He didn't shout or accuse. His calm voice carried more power than anger ever could. When asked what he wanted, he simply said, "Accountability. That's all." People began learning who he truly was, a decorated veteran, a man who had risked everything for his country. That revelation changed the tone of the public conversation. News channels started running stories not just about the shooting, but about the system behind it. How could a man who defended the nation lose his best friend in his own neighborhood because of fear and assumption? One anchor asked during a broadcast. Letters began arriving at his house from all over the country. Some came from veterans who said they understood his pain. Others came from strangers who had lost pets and shared how deeply they connected with his story. There were drawings from children, cards, and even offers from people who wanted to help him get another dog. He appreciated the kindness, but he wasn't ready. Shadow wasn't replaceable. One afternoon, as he was sorting through the mail, he came across a small envelope without a return address. Inside was a folded note and a photo. The note read, "You're not alone, brother." The photo showed a group of soldiers standing together in uniform. They were his old Delta Force teammates. Seeing their faces again brought a flood of memories. He sat down and stared at the picture for a long time. Those men had been through everything with him. Missions, nights in deserts, years of silence. Maybe they had seen the story on the news. Maybe they were reaching out. The next day, he got a call from an unfamiliar number. When he answered, a familiar voice said, "It's been a while, Captain." He recognized it instantly, one of his closest teammates from years ago. They talked for hours. The man told him everything that happened. His friend listened quietly, then said, "We've got your back. Don't let them bury this." Their conversation reminded him of something he'd forgotten, the strength that comes from brotherhood. He had spent so long trying to escape his past, but maybe now that past was what he needed most. He didn't want revenge, but he wanted to stand up, not just for Shadow, but for everyone who had faced injustice and stayed silent. A week later, he attended a community meeting organized in the town hall. The room was full of people, neighbors, reporters, local leaders. The police department had sent a spokesperson, a nervous young officer who tried to read a prepared statement about ongoing investigations. The man stood up from his seat quietly and walked to the microphone. The room fell silent. He began to speak softly, his voice steady. "I came here today not as a soldier, but as a man who lost his best friend. I've seen danger in my life. I know what real threats look like. My dog wasn't one." He paused, looking around at the crowd. "Fear makes people do terrible things, but fear can't be an excuse forever. We all deserve better, from those who protect us from each other." The room was still. Even the officer lowered his head. Someone in the audience started to clap, and soon the whole room followed. Cameras flashed, but the man didn't care about that. He felt lighter, as if speaking those words had lifted a weight from his chest. That night, videos from the meeting spread online. People called him the calm soldier and the man who turned pain into power. Interviews flooded in from national news networks. It was overwhelming, but he handled it the way he handled everything, with discipline and quiet strength. Behind the scenes, his lawyer gathered evidence and pushed for the case to be reopened. Witnesses came forward, including the workers who had made the call that started it all. They admitted they never saw the man do anything wrong. The officer who fired the shot was placed on leave while investigations continued. Through all of this, the man kept to his routine. He still woke early every morning, though now his walks were alone. He still paused at the corner where Shadow used to stop and look up at him. Each time he would whisper, "Still with me, buddy," before continuing. Weeks later, a group of veterans visited him at home. They brought coffee and sat with him in the backyard. They didn't talk much about the case or the police. Instead, they shared stories of their own struggles after leaving the service, how they missed their brothers, how the world sometimes felt harder to survive than the battlefield. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he belonged somewhere again. After they left, he stood alone in the yard, thinking about how much his life had changed in just a few months. Shadow was gone, but the story wasn't over. The fight for justice had become bigger than him. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about healing, for him, for others, maybe even for the ones who had made the mistake. That night, he wrote in his notebook again. His words were softer this time. He wrote about forgiveness, not as something easy or quick, but as something necessary to move forward. He wrote, "We can't undo what's been done, but we can decide what it means." When he put the pen down, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He looked at Shadow's leash and smiled faintly. "You're still helping me," he whispered. Outside, the moonlight spilled across the quiet street. Somewhere far away, a dog barked. It didn't hurt to hear it anymore. Instead, it made him feel connected, to life, to memory, to everything that still mattered. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow he would continue the fight, not with anger, but with truth. And somewhere deep in his heart, he felt that Shadow was walking beside him again, step by step, guiding him through the darkness toward the light that waited ahead. Days turned into weeks, and weeks slowly slipped into months. The man's life was no longer quiet, but he had learned to carry the noise differently. Reporters still tried to reach him. Neighbors still greeted him softly, unsure what to say. But deep inside, he had changed. The pain that once felt unbearable had become a purpose. He had seen how his story touched people, how it made them question the world around them. And in that, he had found something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of duty again. One morning, he received a letter from a university asking him to speak to their students about leadership and responsibility. At first, he wanted to refuse. He didn't see himself as a teacher. But after reading the letter again, he noticed one sentence that stood out. "Your calm in the face of pain inspired us." That line stayed in his mind all day. Maybe sharing his experience could help others understand that strength wasn't always about fighting. It was sometimes about staying calm when your heart was breaking. A week later, he stood on a small stage in front of a group of young people. He wasn't dressed like a soldier. He wore simple clothes the same way he did every day. When he began speaking, his voice was quiet but steady. He talked about service, sacrifice, and the weight of responsibility that comes with power. Then he told them about Shadow. The room grew silent. When he finished, no one moved for a few seconds. Then the students stood and clapped. It wasn't loud or wild. It was the kind of slow, respectful applause that carried meaning. After the event, several students came up to him, asking questions, sharing their own stories. One young woman said, "I lost my father to an unjust situation. Hearing you talk helped me believe there's still hope." He smiled faintly and said, "Hope is like light. Even in the darkest place, it's there. You just have to look for it." Walking out of the building that day, he felt lighter. For months, he had been focused on what was taken from him. But now he began to see what had been given, an opportunity to make a difference again. Meanwhile, the investigation into Shadow's death was still ongoing. The police department had tried to settle quietly, but the public pressure kept it alive. People wanted answers. The lawyer representing him called often with updates, but he didn't rush the process. He wanted everything done the right way. "Truth doesn't need speed," he often said. "It needs patience." One afternoon, as he was cleaning his porch, a car pulled up outside. A woman stepped out holding a small brown puppy. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she said nervously. "I work at the animal shelter downtown. We heard about your story. This little one was rescued a few days ago. He's scared of almost everything, but when I brought him here, he wagged his tail the moment he saw your house." The man looked at the puppy, who stared back with wide, curious eyes. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then he knelt down slowly. The puppy licked his hand. He didn't adopt him right away, but that night he couldn't stop thinking about the small creature's eyes. They reminded him of the first time he met Shadow, nervous yet full of trust. The next morning he went to the shelter. The puppy ran to him the moment he entered. That was all the sign he needed. He took the puppy home. He didn't name him for a few days. He just called him Buddy until one night when he looked out the window and saw the moon shining brightly. The puppy was curled up beside his chair. He whispered, "I think I'll call you Light." It felt right. Light became his new companion, and slowly his house began to feel alive again. Light was nothing like Shadow, smaller, clumsier, and full of endless curiosity. He would chew on anything he could find and bark at his reflection in the window. But he brought laughter back into the man's life. Sometimes, while watching the puppy chase his tail, he caught himself smiling without realizing it. It didn't erase the pain, but it softened it. Around this time, the lawyer called with news. The state investigation was coming to an end, and a public report would soon be released. "They found inconsistencies," the lawyer said. The officers gave different statements. "The footage supports your version." The man listened quietly. "What happens next?" he asked. "Accountability," the lawyer replied. When the report was published, it confirmed what many already suspected. The shooting had been unjustified. The officer who fired the shot faced disciplinary action, and the department issued an apology. But what caught everyone's attention was the man's response. Instead of anger, he spoke with compassion. At a press conference, he said, "I've seen what anger can do. It destroys people. What I want is change, not hatred. If this makes one officer think before pulling a trigger, then maybe Shadow's loss won't be in vain." Those words spread faster than any headline. People admired his calm strength. He was invited to speak at community meetings, veteran gatherings, and even police training seminars. At first he was hesitant, but soon he realized that his words carried weight. He could reach both sides, the ones who had lost faith in justice and the ones who wanted to restore it. One evening, after a long talk at a local police academy, a young officer approached him. "Sir," the officer said, "I wanted to thank you. Your story changed the way I see this job. Fear can't control us. We have to lead with respect." The man nodded, his eyes warm. "That's all I ever wanted to hear." Back home, he found Light waiting by the door, wagging his tail wildly. He knelt down, rubbing the puppy's head. "You see, buddy," he whispered, "the world isn't all bad. It just forgets sometimes." As weeks went by, more veterans reached out to him, inviting him to join a program that helped soldiers adjust to civilian life. He accepted. The first meeting was held in a quiet hall, filled with people who, like him, carried silent wounds. They talked, listened, and shared stories. For many of them, their biggest struggle wasn't war, it was coming home. He listened closely to each of them, realizing how many were still fighting invisible battles. One man spoke about losing his family after coming back, another about sleepless nights and guilt. The man shared his own story, not about war, but about loss and forgiveness. "We can't control what happens to us," he said gently, "but we can control how we rise from it." His words brought quiet tears to some of the faces in the room. From that day, they began inviting him to speak regularly. Light became a familiar sight at those meetings, sitting quietly beside him. The puppy had grown a little but still had that same innocent face. People often reached down to pet him during breaks, and he would wag his tail happily. In his own small way, Light was helping others heal too. Months later, the man received an official recognition from the mayor's office for his contributions to the community. He didn't attend the ceremony for fame. He went because he wanted to honor Shadow's memory. Standing on the stage holding the framed certificate, he said, "This isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who stood for what's right, and to one loyal friend who reminded me what love really means." The crowd stood and applauded. That night, back home, he placed the certificate beside Shadow's leash and the silver medal. The three items stood side by side, symbols of the three parts of his life: the soldier he once was, the friend he lost, and the man he had become. Time continued to move forward, but every evening he still visited Shadow's grave. Light would sit beside him quietly as he spoke softly to the wind. "I'm doing my best, old friend," he would say. "You taught me that strength isn't in anger, it's in love." One day, as he sat there, a boy from the neighborhood rode his bicycle up the hill. It was the same boy who had once admired Shadow. "Mister," the boy said, "your new dog's cool. He looks happy." The man smiled. "He's learning from the best." The boy looked at the grave marker and asked, "Do you miss him every day?" The man nodded. "Every single one. But missing someone doesn't mean you stop living. It means you carry them with you." The boy nodded thoughtfully and rode away. The man watched him go, feeling a quiet peace. Maybe that was the real purpose of everything that had happened, to pass on something meaningful to others. That evening, he sat on the porch with Light curled up beside him. The sunset painted the sky in deep shades of gold and red. He took a deep breath, feeling the soft wind brush against his face. For the first time in a long while, there was no heaviness in his chest. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled him. It had become part of his strength. He looked at Light and whispered, "You know, buddy, maybe peace isn't a place. Maybe it's a choice." The puppy tilted his head as if listening. As the first stars began to appear, the man thought about all that had happened: the loss, the anger, the fight for truth, and the healing that followed. Life had taken him through storms he never expected, but in the end, it had also given him a chance to rebuild. He picked up his notebook and wrote one last line for the night. Some battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with patience, truth, and heart. He closed the notebook, looked up at the night sky, and smiled. Somewhere deep inside, he felt that Shadow was proud. And for the first time since that terrible night, he truly felt at peace. The morning after the story broke on the news, the man sat quietly on his porch holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The world now knew a little more about him than he had ever wanted to share. For years he had kept his past hidden, locked behind a calm smile and a soft voice. But now the truth had come out, not through his words but through the people who once fought beside him. Old brothers in arms had reached out, calling, sending messages, some even driving down to see him. They didn't ask how he was. They already knew. They had seen that look before, the mix of pain, control, and quiet fire. He didn't want revenge. That word didn't sit right with him. What he wanted was justice, the kind that didn't destroy but revealed, the kind that healed the cracks people refused to see. He had lived long enough to know that anger burned fast, but truth lasted. So he decided to use the skills he had, not to fight, but to expose what had been hidden behind excuses and false reports. He started small. He spent his nights reading through police statements and media coverage. He listened to every recording he could find. He noticed things, small changes in words, differences in tone, phrases that didn't match what witnesses had said. It was a puzzle, and puzzles had always been his thing. In Delta Force, every mission depended on seeing what others missed. This was no different, except now, the battlefield was truth itself. He contacted a local reporter, someone known for fair stories and quiet persistence. When they met, he didn't start with his military background. He simply shared the facts, times, reports, witness accounts, and a few photos he had collected. The reporter listened carefully and by the end of the conversation, promised to help. It wasn't about making headlines. It was about giving voice to something that had been buried under fear and bureaucracy. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the story began to unfold publicly. People learned who the man really was. The internet buzzed with disbelief. How could someone who had risked his life for his country be treated with such disregard? The more people learned, the more support poured in, not only from veterans but from ordinary citizens who felt the injustice deeply. The police department tried to stay quiet at first. They hoped the noise would fade, that people would move on. But the story wouldn't die. The reporter's article included details they couldn't deny. Body cam footage, radio calls, and statements that didn't match up. Each line pulled the curtain back a little further. Still, the man kept his composure. He never yelled, never accused, never insulted anyone. When reporters came to his door, he spoke softly, choosing his words with care. "This isn't just about me," he said once during a live interview. "It's about accountability. It's about respect, and for every life, no matter how small." His calmness became his strength. People saw in him something they hadn't seen in a long time: grace under pain. It made them listen, even those who didn't want to. It made people question not just what had happened, but why things like this kept happening. Behind the scenes, the man gathered his old contacts, people in law, media, and even within certain branches of government who respected him from his service years. They quietly passed him documents, offered advice, guided him through the legal maze. He wasn't alone anymore. The same discipline that once kept soldiers alive now became the force behind a growing movement. Community leaders invited him to speak at gatherings. He didn't see himself as a speaker, but he went anyway. Standing before crowds, he shared pieces of his story. Never the parts of war, but the lessons it taught him. Strength, he told them, is not about the power to fight. It's about the patience to wait for truth to surface. People began organizing candlelight walks in memory of his dog. Kids made drawings. Local artists painted murals of loyalty and love. The community, once divided by fear and misunderstanding, started to unite. The man would drive by sometimes, quietly watching strangers standing together, and for the first time in a long while he felt hope rising again. The police chief finally requested a private meeting. At first, the man hesitated. Part of him didn't want to face them again, but another part knew this was necessary. When he arrived at the department, cameras flashed outside, but inside it was quiet. The chief looked uneasy, knowing the world's eyes were on them. He offered an apology, words that felt rehearsed but still carried a hint of regret. The man listened, nodded politely, and said something that silenced the room. Apologies matter only when they come with change. That sentence stayed with the chief long after he left. As weeks went by, the investigation reopened officially. Independent reviewers stepped in, and this time, nothing was hidden. Every detail was examined. Every officer's decision was evaluated. The truth was undeniable. Mistakes had been made, and they could no longer be brushed aside. It wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuilding trust. When the official report came out, the public read it with mixed emotions. Some were angry, others relieved, but everyone agreed on one thing: the system had to improve. Training programs were revised, accountability procedures strengthened, and community dialogues began between officers and residents. The man, however, stayed out of the spotlight as much as he could. He wasn't chasing fame. He had found something more meaningful: purpose. He started working quietly with organizations that trained service dogs for veterans dealing with trauma. He knew how much a loyal companion could heal what humans sometimes couldn't. Shadow's memory became more than just grief. It became a bridge for healing others. He visited training centers often, watching young dogs learning to obey commands, their tails wagging with excitement. Each time he felt a soft ache in his chest, but also pride. The bond between a soldier and a dog was special, built on trust, silence, and understanding. He wanted others to experience that same comfort. As time went on, his story spread beyond the city. Interviews, documentaries, and even podcasts wanted to feature him, but he kept turning most of them down. He didn't want his pain to become entertainment. When he did speak publicly, his words were always focused on empathy. "It's easy to judge," he said in one interview. "It's harder to understand, but only understanding brings change." His humility touched people. Even those who had once doubted him now spoke his name with respect. Veterans who had remained quiet for years started sharing their own stories of being misunderstood or mistreated. A wave of compassion followed, slow but steady. One evening he sat by the river near his home, the same place he had often walked with Shadow. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. He closed his eyes, listening to the soft flow of water, and for a moment he imagined the sound of paws running beside him. He smiled gently. "You did good, boy," he whispered. His phone buzzed with a message from the reporter who had helped him at the beginning. "The department announced new reforms today," it said. "Your story made a difference." He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "It wasn't just my story. It was ours." Later that week, he was invited to speak at a police academy. The cadet sat silently as he shared his experience. He didn't blame anyone. Instead, he spoke about awareness and empathy. "When you wear that badge," he told them, "you carry more than authority. You carry responsibility for every life you encounter, even when it doesn't look like yours." By the time he finished, the room was quiet. Some cadets had tears in their eyes. He knew that not everyone would change overnight, but even one heart shifted was a start. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a quiet rhythm. The attention faded, as all stories eventually do, but the impact stayed. He continued his volunteer work, helped veterans, mentored young officers, and kept tending to the garden behind his house where he had buried Shadow's collar beneath a small tree. Every now and then, he'd receive letters from strangers, people thanking him for standing firm without anger, for showing that peace was possible even in pain. He'd read them quietly and smile, never feeling like a hero, just a man who refused to let bitterness define him. One night, as he locked his door and looked at the stars, he thought about how far he had come. From the silence of loss to the strength of purpose, he had walked a long road, and though the ache of losing his dog would never fully fade, it had led him toward something greater, a chance to teach the world what true strength looked like. He whispered softly, "You still guide me, buddy." The wind rustled through the trees, almost like a reply, gentle and kind. He went inside, turned off the lights, and sat in his chair for a while, letting the quiet fill the room. The battle was over, not with violence or rage, but with patience and truth. He had fought with honor once again, this time not for his country, but for compassion, and as he drifted to sleep that night, there was peace in his heart, the kind that only comes when justice meets grace, and pain transforms into purpose. The months following the investigation were quiet in some ways, but full of change in others. The man had returned to his routines, walking with light every morning, tending to his garden, and spending evenings writing in his notebook. But beneath the calm surface, he felt the world shifting. People had listened. People had learned. And slowly, he realized that the pain of losing Shadow had transformed into something more powerful than grief. It had become a lesson he could share with others. The city recognized his courage quietly. A local community center asked him to lead a series of workshops for young men and women on leadership, responsibility, and resilience. The first session was small, with only a handful of attendees. He spoke softly, his voice steady, telling them about the moments in life that test a person, the choices that define character, and the importance of compassion in every action. He never mentioned anger or revenge. Instead, he focused on trust, respect, and how to respond to unfairness with dignity. One young man asked, "How do you stay calm when everything goes wrong?" The man looked at him for a moment, his eyes steady. "It's not about being calm all the time," he said. "It's about making a choice not to let your pain control you. It's about acting with purpose even when your heart feels broken." The young man nodded, writing every word in his notebook. Others listened quietly, absorbing the lesson. Outside the sessions, light became a symbol of hope for those who attended. Children and adults alike were drawn to the puppy's energy and innocence. He would sit quietly beside the man, wagging his tail whenever someone approached. For many, watching the bond between man and dog reminded them of the strength that could come from love and loyalty. Even in the smallest of forms. The police department had taken significant steps after the investigation. New policies were introduced to prevent similar incidents, and officers were required to undergo training in empathy, de-escalation, and community relations. The man was invited to contribute to these sessions not as a critic but as a guide. His experience gave him insight into how fear and misunderstanding could lead to tragedy, and how awareness could prevent it. He didn't just focus on police training. He worked with local schools, youth programs, and veteran groups, sharing the lessons he had learned from Shadow's death. His story became a bridge between communities that had once been divided by fear or silence. People started to see him not only as a veteran or a survivor, but as a mentor, a voice of calm in a world that often moved too fast, too loudly. One afternoon, while working with a group of veterans who were struggling with anxiety and PTSD, he noticed how carefully they watched him. They were hesitant at first, unsure whether to trust someone new. But when he spoke about patience, accountability, and coping with loss, their expressions softened. He didn't use fancy words or tell stories of war. He spoke from the heart, and that was enough. After the sessions, one veteran approached him quietly. "I've been avoiding people for years," he said. "Your words. They made me feel like I could try again." The man nodded, offering a gentle smile. "We all carry scars," he said. "But scars can guide us, not define us." At home, the evenings were quieter but comforting. He would sit on the porch, watching the sun set with light beside him, and reflect on the changes around him. The small moments of happiness were healing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He often thought about Shadow, the friend he had lost, and felt gratitude for the lessons the dog had taught him. Shadow had shown him loyalty, courage, and unconditional love. Now he tried to carry those lessons into every interaction, every decision. As his influence grew, invitations arrived from far beyond the city. Schools in other states asked him to speak. Organizations requested his guidance, and even media outlets sought interviews, not to sensationalize but to share the message of resilience and calm strength. Each time he declined most offers, focusing only on places where he felt his words could truly make a difference. The local community never forgot him. People began to hold annual events in memory of Shadow, celebrating the bond between humans and animals, and the importance of respect and compassion. Children who had once been too shy to speak now came forward to share their stories, inspired by the man who had turned personal loss into a force for good. One evening, as he walked home after speaking at a school, a small crowd of children followed him quietly. Light ran ahead, barking happily. A little girl tugged at his coat. "Sir," she said, "we drew a picture of your dog for you." It's him smiling. He knelt down, taking the drawing gently. It showed a black dog with bright eyes running in the sun. He felt a lump in his throat but smiled. "Thank you," he said softly. "He'd be proud of all of you." The story of Shadow's death and the man's calm response had created ripples beyond his expectations. People began discussing the importance of empathy in daily life, in schools and workplaces, and in communities. The man had not set out to change the world, but his quiet courage and refusal to respond with anger had done just that. He continued to work with veterans and young people, but he also spent time nurturing a new personal project, training service dogs. The program focused on rescuing animals and helping them assist people dealing with trauma. Watching the dogs learn to trust, to obey, and to bond reminded him of the early days with Shadow. Each success was a small victory, a reminder that healing was possible, and that love could guide even the deepest pain into something meaningful. Months later, the police officer involved in Shadow's death faced formal consequences. The public response had ensured that accountability could not be ignored. But the man's approach never wavered. He declined media appearances focused on punishment or criticism, emphasizing instead that the real lesson was in awareness and empathy. "We can't undo what happened," he said once during an interview, "but we can prevent it from happening again." By the end of the year, the man felt a sense of balance he had not experienced in a long time. He still visited Shadow's grave regularly, but those visits were no longer filled with only sorrow. They were moments of reflection, gratitude, and guidance. He would kneel, whispering softly to his lost friend, and leave knowing that Shadow's memory had created something positive in the world. Light had grown into a lively companion. The puppy had become a symbol not just of comfort for him, but of the resilience of life itself. People who visited often remarked on the bond between man and dog, noticing the way Light seemed to understand the emotions of those around him. Children and veterans alike found solace in that simple connection. The man also began writing regularly, sharing lessons from his experiences in short essays and reflections. He never published them widely, but local libraries and community centers displayed them for readers who sought guidance. Each essay focused on patience, integrity, and quiet strength. Every word carried the weight of someone who had faced loss and had chosen compassion over anger. One afternoon, while helping a veteran train a dog, the man noticed a boy watching from a distance. The boy had a shy look, hands stuffed in his pockets. The man smiled and called him over. "Do you want to help?" The boy nodded hesitantly. As he worked with the puppy, he began to smile, and by the end of the session he was laughing. The man watched quietly, understanding that sometimes the simplest actions, guiding a young boy, training a dog, could heal wounds deeper than words ever could. Over time, the community fully embraced him as a mentor and leader, not for fame but because of his heart. People came to him for advice, for guidance, and even for comfort during difficult times. He never boasted, never sought recognition. He simply lived by the lessons Shadow had taught him: loyalty, patience, and love without conditions. Years later, looking back, he understood the full impact of that one tragic night. Shadow's death had brought pain that seemed unbearable at first, but it had also opened doors to new purpose. Through patience, honesty, and compassion, he had turned grief into action, teaching everyone around him that strength is not about power, but about heart. On the anniversary of Shadow's passing, he gathered a small group of friends, veterans, and neighbors at the memorial tree he had planted. Light ran among them, playful and full of life. The man spoke quietly. "We remember not just the loss, but the love. Shadow taught us what loyalty really means. Let's carry that forward in everything we do." People nodded, some wiping tears from their eyes. Children laid flowers at the base of the tree. For him, it was a quiet, meaningful way to honor his friend, to continue teaching what mattered most. As he walked home that evening, the sky painted with soft orange and purple hues, he felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he was ready. He had learned that grief can transform into purpose, and that compassion can influence even those who seem unreachable. Sitting on his porch later, he watched the stars appear. Light curled at his feet. He whispered softly, "We've done well, buddy. You'd be